Hello students, this is Mrs. Miller, and the purpose of this video is to walk you through our final assignment for the Titanic. Now, before you start, there are some papers you should have in front of you. You should have the You Be the Judge writing prompt, which looks like this. You should have the title page and the lined paper so that you can write your essay. You should have the grading rubric so that you know how your writing is going to be scored. And you should also have the You Be the Judge exemplar response. Now, after I go through the writing prompt with you, I'm going to go through the exemplar response so that you can see what good writing looks like. Now, the prompt says this: there was an inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic and the overwhelming loss of life in 1912. Several factors played into the sinking of the ship, and yet no one was blamed for the disaster. Now it's your turn to be the judge. Based on what you learned about the Titanic, who or what is to blame for the tragedy? Use two or more specific details from one or more sources in your writing to support your opinion. Now, for our purposes, our sources are going to be the movie, the video field trip that we went on, and also the story in our textbook called Exploring the Titanic. Now, for be sure to include, it says you need to include a title, an explanation of who or what is to blame for the disaster, an explanation of the role the selected factor had in the tragedy, an explanation of why the factor is to blame for the Titanic disaster, and an explanation of how the disaster could have been averted if this one factor had been different. Now you need to include two or more details from one or more sources to support your opinion. Again, sources include the video field trip and the story that we read in the textbook. Now, if you're familiar with other information about the Titanic because you read another book about it, you're more than welcome to include that information in your writing. You need to make sure that you have an introduction, body, and conclusion, and you must follow the rules of standard English. Now let's take a look at the grading rubric. This is how I will be grading your essay. First, you have to make sure that you clearly contain a title, an introduction, and a body and a conclusion. So I know that you've moved on to a different part because you are using new paragraphs and you're making sure that you indent. Who is to blame? You have to make sure you fully explain who or what is to blame for the disaster. You have to fully explain the role that that selected factor had in the tragedy. You need to fully explain how the disaster could have been averted with the selected factor. And you need to accurately use details from a source to support your opinion. And don't forget, you must follow the rules of standard English. So this is how I will be grading your work. Now let's move on to an exemplar response. Please know that since we're going over this exemplar response and you have it in front of you, you cannot use the factor that I selected in your essay. You need to pick a different factor. Okay? Here we go. Right off the bat, you see that I have a title, The Disastrous Decision. That's what I named mine. I'm going to go ahead and read it. People go on cruises expecting to be safe. They rely on the ship designers and the safety board to make good decisions so that every passenger on board has a good experience. So in 1912, when passengers boarded the Titanic, they thought that they would safely arrive in New York. Unbeknown to them, they wouldn't make it to their destination due to a horrible decision made by Bruce Ismay before the ship was even built. The choice to reduce the number of lifeboats from 48 to 16 had a catastrophic effect and led to the countless deaths of many passengers. For this reason, I blame Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Shipping Company, for the catastrophic loss of life. So you see here that I have my introduction, my opening paragraph, and in my introduction I gave you a little bit of background about the Titanic, but this is what I really want you to see. I want you to see that I restated and answered right there who I blamed, and I also said why I blamed him. Okay? Now I'm going to move on to the body of my essay, and I'm going to explain a little more. In January of 1910, Bruce Ismay met with Alexander Carlisle to discuss the design of the ship. The original plan had been to include 48 lifeboats on board the Titanic so that there would be enough for all passengers in the event of an emergency. However, safety apparently wasn't Ismay's main concern. He was more worried about the looks of the ship, so he had the number of lifeboats reduced from 48 to 16. In the inquiry of 1912, it was revealed that Ismay said, "People don't pay to look at lifeboats." This was his justification for having 32 lifeboats removed. Now, I'd like to point out to you that I used information from our sources to put the body of my essay together. The original plan to include 48 lifeboats, that was right from the video field trip that we took. And then the decision to reduce it from 48 to 16, that was also from the video field trip. And finally, I used a specific direct quote from Ismay right here when I said people don't pay to look at lifeboats. So this indicates that I read the story or I watched the video and I was able to use details from that to support my opinion. You have to make sure that you do the same. You need to make sure that you include at least 2 details from the video field trip or from the story to support your opinion about who's to blame. Let's keep going. This factor is to blame for the disaster because this was a deliberate choice that never should have been made. So right here, once again, I restated and answered what the prompt said that I had to include, and now I'm going to explain. Ismay knew that there would be a lot of people on the Titanic, and he knew that by removing a certain number of lifeboats, there wouldn't be enough room for everyone in the event of an accident. Sure, he knew that the British Board of Trade required that there only be 16 lifeboats aboard a ship, but that policy was put into place when ships were a lot smaller and carried fewer passengers. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to point out that once again, I used a specific detail from the video to back up what I was saying. Let's continue on. Ismay should have had better judgment when it came to the number of lifeboats on the ship. This disaster could have been averted if Ismay never would have made the decision to reduce the number of lifeboats. Had the number been kept at 48, every passenger on board could have been saved, regardless of all of the other factors. And now I'm going to wrap it up with my concluding paragraph. There were several factors that led to the Titanic disaster, but Bruce Ismay's decision to reduce the number of lifeboats is the factor that carries the most blame for the tragedy. His number one priority should have been to keep his passengers safe, as opposed to eliminating lifeboats so that they had a better view. Ismay had no way of knowing that disaster would strike, but he should have taken the appropriate safety precautions to prevent the appalling death toll that still affects people today. And my friends, this is an example of good writing. I made sure that I fully addressed the writing prompts, and I followed the rules of standard English and made sure that I used specific details from the sources. And so now it's your turn. Go ahead and plan out your writing and use the lined paper to write your essay.